Good afternoon, I'm Donald Maurice. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2019 NZBBC interview series hosted by the New Zealand School of Music at Victoria University and SOUNZ Centre for New Zealand Music. NZBBC stands for New Zealand Baby Boomer Composers. We're interviewing 10 composers in this series, 2 from Auckland, 2 from Hamilton, 2 from Wellington, 2 from Christchurch and 2 from Dunedin. It's my pleasure today to welcome Eve de Castro-Robinson.
Thank you, Donald.
I'm just going to tell a little bit about Eve before I ask her some questions. She is one of New Zealand's foremost composers whose works are performed widely both here and internationally. She is twice winner of both the SOUNZ Contemporary Award and the Philip Neal Memorial Prize. She has been commissioned and performed by many leading performers, including all of New Zealand's professional orchestras, the New Zealand String Quartet, the New Zealand Trio, the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra, Nash Ensemble of London, the Dutch Hex, Alexander Ivashkin and Jane Manning. Eve has had 3 solo CDs on the Atoll label and 3 on the Rattle label, and single works on many other recordings. She was selected for residencies including at the Atlantic Centre for the Arts, Florida in 2010, at the Banff Centre in 2012. Her large-scale commission for the NZSO, The Glittering Hosts of Heaven, was premiered in 2013. Her Rattle recording, The Gristle of Knuckles, won her Best Classical Award at the 2018 New Zealand Music Awards. Eve is Associate Professor in Composition and Director of the Karl-Heinz Company at the University of Auckland and is Deputy Chair of the Board of SOUNZ Centre for New Zealand Music. And so now for my first question for Eve, can you tell us a little about where you were born, what it was like at home and your family with music? Were you surrounded by music in your upbringing?
Good question, thanks, Donald. I was born in England, actually, because my New Zealand father was there doing his surgical degrees. So that was a happenstance kind of thing, but my mother was English. So I've got that dual background geographically. And I can't remember much sonically from the English years. When we came back here, I was 5 and I went to school and did all the normal things. But my first sonic memory is quite an impassioned one, and it stayed with me because Dad came home with a record downstairs at home, and there was a fire burning in the grate, and he put it on. I can picture the whole scene. It must have been about 6 or 7, and I remember the fire crackling, and it was a record of African drumming. And it was more that I sensed very viscerally Dad's excitement listening to the drumming, and the fact that he was wanting me to be part of the experience. And then at the complete other end of the scale, I got huge girlhood crushes, as quite a lot of contemporaries, particularly females, did, on films like The Sound of Music, My Fair Lady, Mary Poppins, that kind of thing. And I remember getting, I think for a birthday present, the record of My Fair Lady, and I think I can see the cover now, and for some reason secretly locking, or at least hiding away in the room that we had this big gramophone player, putting the record on and conducting to it. You know, I didn't really go on to do any conducting. It's too hard and generally too time-consuming. But I do remember that, and I loved the Ascot Gavotte, if you know that piece of music from My Fair Lady, and just kneeling there as a shy little child, which is presumably why I closed the door and locked myself in, and conducting. And then I went on and did piano lessons, sort of struggled all the way through up until teenagehood, where I did my ATCL, but I had to sit it 3 times before I passed it, because I'd get nervous and my hands would shake.
And did you study any other instruments?
Yes, a little bit like Glenda Keane was talking earlier. I thought I'd do the cello, learn the cello for a year at intermediate school, and the teacher was Virginia Hopkins, who I thought was older, but actually must have only been a few years older than me at the time. And she had come to the house, and I'd try to play, and I loved the idea of it and the sound of it, but I remember tuning it once, and the string snapped back in my face, and I thought, that's it with the cello. So I've never had much stickability with playing instruments. I haven't got the discipline for it, and I'm too reticent as a performer and all those things. And then as a teenager, I was into rock music a lot, and I thought, right, drum kit. So I encouraged Mum to let me buy a drum kit, which I bought from Harmony House, which was if anyone knows Auckland, it's a wonderful little second-hand shop at the top of Queen Street there. And I got a shiny blue drum kit for $100 and brought it home and sort of practiced fairly pathetically and had lessons from a guy called Peter Slade, which was quite a good name for a sort of rock drummer. And then and let it slip because it was simply too hard. You know, the image of an instrument is quite a thing. But actually when you're playing paradiddles on a snare drum, it's hard. And I don't mind admitting that I've been very disciplined about some things with composing, but learning instruments, you know, 3 goes to get ATCL, never again.
So did you play drum kit in a band at school?
No, school music was never really much of a thing for me. School was never much of a thing for me. I didn't care for it much.
But you did show up?
Yes, less so as time went on. I mean, when I got to the end of the sixth form, I couldn't wait to leave. So there was a lot of, you know, bunking off school, wagging we used to call it, and getting hauled up by the headmistress for having blue toenail polish or trimming my felt hat to the point of no return and all that kind of thing. I was always a sort of quiet rebel, and I don't think rebellious sort of girls at Epsom Grammar did music. There were some fine musicians came out of there. Wilma Smith was there a year ahead of me, playing, and another person, Glenda mentioned earlier, Mary Martin, who was Mary Martin, playing the flute. They went on to great things. But music at school in the 70s at Epsom Girls' Grammar wasn't really a thing. Well, I suppose we did music classes, but I can't remember much what happened in them.
So was there a point during that time that you decided you wanted to be a composer, or did that come later?
Oh no, that was much later, because I left school and went straight to work at the Inner City News as a paste-up artist, because I had a bit of a sort of facility for graphic drawing and design, graphic design. So I did that, and I did all sorts of other jobs, and working in gas stations and working in pantries making quiches and all that sort of stuff for quite a few years before I embarked on university. I mean, I was at ATI, as it then was the Auckland Technical Institute, now the Auckland University of Technology, doing graphic design. I did that. And again, making my life to sound like an abject failure up until, but graphic design was also a thing where you needed absolute talent and absolute discipline. Well, I had vague talent, but if you wanted to then take it through and work in the industry, it required a certain type of person. I was rather ideologically opposed to advertising as being a way to make a living. So I finished that, but I did meet the person I subsequently married, Ken Robinson, who was one of my lecturers, and I did fine arts prelim with him. So I got together with him, and he took a sabbatical, and we travelled overseas, and I'd been teaching piano pupils and working part-time as a graphic designer, that kind of thing. And we were talking about what I'd do when I came back, and I realised that I loved music the best, but I didn't quite know what to do with it. So it was a bit strange looking back, because I knew I wasn't going to be a performer, and I certainly hadn't thought of composing as a thing, because it just simply hadn't been an option. You know, composers with the dead white European males that actually most people still think they are. Not people in this room, of course, thank goodness. So it wasn't till I got home, enrolled at university in a part-time year with John Rimmer and people like that, and he said, now we'll try some composing. And I literally thought, and I was about 24 by then, 23, 24, and I literally thought, how do you mean compose? You mean make it up? And that's how not naive so much as just untouched by that particular idea hitherto, or heretofore. Yeah.
So when you started university, was it your intention just to do a music degree to learn about music, or was it to actually study composition?
No, certainly nothing to do with competition. I thought, because I'm a bit impulsive, I think, right, I love music, I'll go and do a music degree and see what happens. And to get in to the place, I think, I'm just referring to Glenda because I've just had the pleasure of listening to her talk. I hadn't done UE, had I done UE? I think I'd got accredited UE or whatever it was, hadn't done music in it. So you had to go in for an interview and play something. And I went into a room and there was the late Tony Jennings, a wonderful early music specialist, you'll remember him, John Rimmer, and I think perhaps Douglas Muse, although you wouldn't not remember if Douglas had been there, so perhaps it was somewhere else, Peter Godfrey. And I walked in and I said, I've got Beethoven and Lilburn to play, I must leave. And John Rimmer, who I didn't know then or yet, said, oh, Lilburn, please, we've had Beethoven all morning. And so I sat at this piano, and I can remember because I was a nervous player, and he put his hand on the end of the piano and looked out into the middle distance and listened. And that stayed with me as well, that he was listening, of course, to the music of Lilburn, who influenced him so much. And so I played that, one of the occasional pieces that I still love, the Adagio Sostenuto, wonderful little piece, small but perfectly formed sort of thing. And I got into the place on the basis of that and being okay at theory, that kind of thing.
So your people who guided you in composition studies would have been Douglas Muse and John Rimmer?
Yes, and John Elmsley latterly, but Douglas Muse was less an influence from, as a composer teaching, but just the sheer force of that man's personality. He was an eccentric to the point of no return. He used to build Meccano, and he built a Meccano model of the clock tower at the University of Auckland, which was across the road from the School of Music. And he was a genius, a sort of old-fashioned music genius. And so he'd never get away with it these days. He'd sort of stroll into the lecture, where it was a small group of students, 10 minutes late, and he had this strange Newfoundland accent. And he had this sort of falsetto, where he'd talk like this, and he'd come in and he'd say, he'd play a group of notes on the piano, and he'd say, Eve, sing that back to me in reverse. And so Douglas encouraged a sense of immediate musicality that I actually didn't have very well. And he forced you to listen, particularly in a harmonic way, and that didn't necessarily suit me either, because I've never had a strong sense of harmony. In fact, as you get older, you worry less about what people think about you, I think. So I admit to students now, I say, look, I don't have much of an ear for harmony. I'm not that good at rhythm. Melody, I have found my own way round. What else is there? I'm better at all the other parameters, like timbre and gesture and texture and a sense of duration, that kind of thing. So So Musa as a teacher was inspirational in terms of the things that he said, and he'd come in and say, and this is one I still do with my students, he said, "There are no bar lines in music. Who taught you that?" Wow, that's still a great phrase. And I thought, was he? Yeah, true. He said, look, the bar lines are just to create the strong beats or the next beat, this kind of thing. I mean, it's very obvious now, but he was, having said all that, he was flamboyant musically, and he could improvise, Bach, you know, he could improvise a la Bach. But John Rimmer was much more suited to my way of thinking and creatively, because he was a true creative in a way that Douglas wasn't quite.
So you mentioning John Rimmer had a strong influence from Douglas Lilburn. Did that pass through to you through John Rimmer? Did you feel a direct connection with Lilburn's legacy?
That's an interesting question, because I haven't actually thought of it like that before. Certainly we had, he introduced us to the Lilburn lectures, the 1946 one, and I remember reading that famous passage where Lilburn takes the train between Cambridge and Wellington perhaps, and reaches the Central Plateau at night and hangs out of the railway car and sees Ruapehu and Tongariro and the mountains, and thinks that he's as far away from Mozart as the moon. I'm paraphrasing there. And that had an influence me, as did Rimmer in a similar way, the sense of being in New Zealand and how to make sense of it, that came through from Lilburn. Lilburn personally was rather a taciturn, difficult kind of bloke, which was never quite acknowledged at the time. We all met Lilburn by virtue of we Aucklanders coming down from Auckland and coming to some festival or another and running up against him. And I think he's been hugely valued as representing the first major European Western art composer that we've all been, that's been important. Less so now, I think, as the times have gone on, because of the conservatism of his orchestral, instrumental musical legacy, more so perhaps by virtue of his electronic music. But the link through Rimmer would have been all those things, the importance of New Zealandness, the geography, the sonic environment, that kind of thing, and that John Rimmer had, and that also Jack Boddy, who I miss very much coming down to the Adam concert room here. He also had a sort of fierce loyalty to this place and the music making within it that I think I've inherited.
So that legacy from Lilburn of having a national identity, has that transferred to you? Do you feel in your composition that you want to be identified as a New Zealand composer? And how do you go about it if you do?
No, and I think it's problematic if one tries to go about it. No, I don't think national identity is quite the thing I've ever striven for, but I think it's happened wittingly by virtue of use of geological environmental sounds, as a lot of us have used, birdsong in particular, although of course birds exist everywhere, so it's not a specifically New Zealand thing. It's a problematic and increasingly problematical thesis to try and construct, particularly when I look around at the generations below me in music coming through and the increasing internationalism that people have adopted, the kind of, let's call it, complexity of compositional utterances combined with notation, advances in notation and instrumental technique have meant that composers have drawn more from that than a sense of Aotearoa identity here, I think that there's almost that may be seen as rather a cringe factor, lack of sophistication and keeping up with the European Darmstadt Joneses, to come back to Lilburn. I think there's a lot of that now that, ironically, now that Europe is looked to for being where the sophisticated music happens, which is quite interesting given the reverse, because of course Lilburn studied with Vaughan Williams and came back here, and so you still hear glimpses of Vaughan Williams and composers of my generation in particular, but I think we're losing that, and that's just what happens. How do we get onto that?
We're talking about elements of national identity,
Yeah.
and I think you've mentioned bird song. And of course, we do have native birds which are only here.
Yes, absolutely.
We often talk about landscape and space, which is something I hear a lot about when they talk about New Zealand music, that, well, Lilburn in particular, is creation of space. Of course, there's space in any country.
Yes, absolutely.
The other one we haven't touched on yet is incorporating Maori elements into one's compositions. Is that something you have done?
Only to a small extent. I think it's ideologically it's complex, and I'm the sort of person that likes to compose from the inside out, and to actually be incorporating from the outside just takes a bit of a leap, creative leap. The piece I have used some te reo and hints of instruments in is a piece called Hou, H-O-U, which is Maori for wind or breath. And I checked, I think, with Gillian Whitehead first whether it was okay to use the names of Maori gods, Tawhiri Matea, this kind of thing, Rua Moko. And when I asked the singer to sing it, most recently I asked Mere Boynton, who's a wonderful wahine toa from Gisborne, and we worked together in terms of navigating that subtlety of bringing these sounds of the country, really. I mean, Maori music in itself is something very deep, and I think there may be composers in this country who have considered it a bit too lightly and gone for the seductive sound qualities of the instruments. And I don't think it's about that. Otherwise, we would all pick up a purere and whirl it around. That sounds a little bit more critical than I meant it to, but that's rather how I think about it. And so just in that little piece, I was looking for something ritualistic, which is a word that describes quite a lot of my music, and those words fitted in because I was in Moiraki when I heard that the singer Mahina Rangi Toka had died. I don't know if people know Mahina Toka was the most wonderful part Maori, part Scottish, part Pacific Island singer who wrote her own music, and that had quite an effect on me. And Stockhausen had just died as well, so all those things came together in that little vocal piece.
Rua moko Tawhiri Matea Hine nui te pō
I just wanted to ask you, through your life, you mentioned earlier, you know, the rock music and so on. But there are other influences in your life that you've had phases where they've become very like non-Western particularly, where you've really got immersed into different cultures, or any pop music or
Yes,
other genres?
yes, I've always been, I mean, as a teenager or coming through from school or through adolescence, I was just as happy in either realm, rock music or classical music. And so when I was a teenager, you know, around the ages of 15, 16, 17, I remember taking myself off to concerts, and there'd be, or I'd be going to rock students with boyfriends, and the classical concerts on my own from memory. So there was Charles Rosen came and played Beethoven in the town hall, and I remember sitting right above him, and his launching into the Appassionata Sonata and being absolutely taken by that. And then, you know, later that week there'd be Roxy Music or Procol Harum, a lot of those bands from the 70s, fantastic. And then Yehudi Menuhin came out here, Maura Limpany, the pianist, all sorts of wonderful classical artists, and Lou Reed. I mean, I went to, you know, the SOUNZ at Western Springs. So those, the rock and classical have always been equally important to me, I guess, as well as pop music, 60s bubblegum pop music, the Small Faces, that kind of thing. But also, I'm working on a piece now, trumpet chamber concerto for a Scottish trumpeter, and I've called it clarion, so that it's calls of different kinds. And I'm actually harking back to hymns from my childhood, because for whatever reason I went to a couple of schools which had chapels, so we had hymns, a lot of hymn singing, and boy, those really stay with you. And if you haven't had them, like my son, for example, wasn't brought up like that, so he doesn't get hymns. But if you get hymns from that certain Anglican tradition, boy, they're powerful. And they're really, of course, just chorales, and chorales, of course, are very powerful homophonic sort of ritualistic utterances, and I'm very keen on ritual. So, yeah, a lot of influence. I've never got into music from other specific cultures. It just hasn't been it doesn't fit with me. I'm much more influenced as a creative person by the visual arts, by cinema. In fact, I actually go to art galleries more than I do go to concerts, and increasingly, because I don't get the same sort of inspiration or feedback from say a classical concert. I mean, I would mainly go for the contemporary piece, but I have my boredom threshold is such that I just get agitated after a while when I'm trapped in a space, particularly in the traditional concert hall with the rows and being quiet and listening and getting up, and I find it stressful. I mean, it's a strange thing to admit, and there may be other people who find classical concerts stressful in terms of a social experience, but I've realised that I'm one of them. So I'm much happier looking at paintings in a gallery and walking around alone, for example. And certainly cinema is a thing that, and reading poetry, all affect me obliquely, because I don't get musical or creative ideas from listening to other music, I don't think.
So does the art gallery give you inspiration to compose in some way directly?
I think it's deeper and it's different from that. My creative impulses happen slightly independently from composing, if that doesn't sound too abstruse. In other words, the trumpet concerto, what might influence that? So I was looking at some paintings by a Korean painter a couple of nights ago in the city, and there was one in particular that was black and had an abstracty moon shape within it. And you only have to have a certain title and read her intention with it to be affected by it in an inspirational way. Do you see what I mean? A kind of deeper inspiration. Let's say a McCann painting, the huge Gate 3 that's just come up to Auckland from Wellington. Now, experiencing that allows you to look at the world slightly differently through that artistic lens. And I think it's that kind of thing, let's say an imposing black a block with a trajectory of something jumping off it. That's a famous painting called Jump that's also up in Auckland at the moment. It's not a definable, I will therefore construct a piece of music around that singular vision. It's the intensity of that full artistic experience, I think, that comes to bear on my music.
Mm-hmm. No, interesting. Can I take you back a bit to a piece I've been fascinated by of yours that you're aware of, Cyprian's Dance.
Oh yes,
which
yes.
We'll listen to in a minute. You said you wrote it for your son when he was very young. Can you tell us about
the redoubtable
background to that?
Cyprian, who's 27 and 6 foot with hair and grindcore punk sensibilities. He must have been a little boy, and it was a commission from the New Zealand Chamber Orchestra, which was the string offshoot of the NZSO. What a wonderful thing to have, and what a shame it's not there anymore. And it was to be a peaceful string orchestra. I think there was just one double bass, which was Vicky Jones, the marvellous multi-head bass player for many years with the band. And I think I must have thought I'll write it for Cyprian, a little toddler boy of about 2. And so it's quite a vigorous kind of piece. And the NZSO played it the other day. And I don't know quite what I feel about it now, because it seems far too episodic, and it seems to show me up rather badly as a composer who doesn't know how to link things together very well. But it's high-spirited, and Donald Armstrong asked for an allusion to Mozart in it. And so there's a little bit of Eine kleine Nacht music in there, tuned in tritone, something like that.
So I just want to ask you generally about, you've been very prolific as a composer. Are there any pieces that really stand out in your mind as hugely significant for you?
Well, the one I think of immediately is a piece called Tumbling Strings, and its name implies its character. And I wrote it for violin and cello for Doug Beelman and James Tennant, around that similar time, 1992. And I wasn't well, I wasn't mentally ill. I'm a bipolar person, and I was ill with a dreadful depression. And you can hear it in the work. I mean, most of my music's intense, but this work's very intense, and I think that's one of its strengths, because you have these furiously fortissimo, tremoloing strings, and all sorts of percussive sounds and things. Then it's just got a unique character, I think. I come back to that one. It's a little bit too long for its own good, as you know, as pieces are. I think I trimmed it for some occasion or another. In fact, I arranged it for the New Zealand String Quartet, and they played it. But that's the one I come back to as representing something about me that, for better or for worse.
Tell us about the story about the opera Len Lai. That's a
yes,
major thing to take on.
Yeah,
so
that was a
tell
biggie.
us about that.
Well, I'd always loved this character called Len Lai, who's perhaps lesser known to the current generation of students, but he was a real maverick New Zealand artist, filmmaker, and kinetic sculptor. If you know his works, Blade or Universe, or any of the wonderful works of Len's. And at art school, I think my husband Ken had introduced him to us as a filmmaker. And so, you know, decades later, I thought he'd be a great character to write an opera about. So I rang up Roger Horrocks, who's the world authority on Len, and wrote a huge biography about him. And Roger's a mate of mine. And he said, sure, look, keep talking. And so we did. We created this 90-minute opera, and it had a 4-night sellout season at the Maid Mint. And it was lots of fun. When I say fun, the kind of challenging fun that you have when you're working on a big collaborative project. And it's, you know, I think I ran into Chris Blake, composer Chris, who I think you might have talked to, and he had just been through writing a big opera, Bitter Calm, and he was just full of the fallout of that, and things being difficult, and staging and working with collaborators, and he said, oh, whatever you do, don't let the others run away with it. And so that's one of the problems with opera, that the end result is never your original vision of the thing. Having said that, it was a really good project, and I really like a lot of the music I came up with for it.
My barefoot paradise, no school for hundreds of miles. My teachers were the waves, the wind, the clouds, the caves, and all the gods and monsters deep in the sea. At night the sea would hiss, the frost would sting. I'd steal through the dark, shells crackling under my skin, home to wolves and my new father.
I'd like to open to the floor for questions. I'm sure
Sure.
there'll be some. You're A lot of interesting things to say there.
You mentioned a couple of times about how a lot of your pieces have a kind of ritualistic kind of element to them. Could you maybe go into a little bit more detail about that, the ritual?
Yes, I think it's not a thing I've done deliberately, but I think it's getting away from the idea of music, or the kind of music that we're involved with, particularly in an academic sort of cloistered environment. And now that I'm leaving it soon, I can see it much more like that, as being concert music, i.e. stuff that gets played on a stage with the audience sitting in rows. It's the most strange construct when you actually stop and think about it. You know, why are we not surrounded, sitting on the floor while they, whatever, are on a lazy Susan, like in a Chinese restaurant? I mean, that would be fun, just thinking off the top of my head. Most music from the world, around the world, grows from ritual, as we know. Sitting around a fireside, or dancing, or announcing the birth of a baby, or at a funeral, that kind of thing. So things we do sonically when left to our own devices will often give us a clue as to what those rituals and realness of sonic experiences might be, like calling, or singing a lullaby, or singing in the shower, that kind of thing. And I guess that's because of the fact that I don't have strong melodic, harmonic, or rhythmic impulses. That's how I've come at things. I'm walking along, and a sonic impulse comes at me, and I think very choreographically. And I did a recent little piece called Whirl for bass drum, in which the bass drum player does exactly that. This kind of thing makes a sound while doing it. So it's really my way of coming at a thing, and ritual is the best word I can think of describing it as.
You mentioned your early experience listening to the record of drumming, and then later on the drum kit. So I'm a little bit surprised to hear you say that you were not particularly strong on rhythm.
It's not just me being self-deprecating, it's that composing music is different from any strengths of performing it, obviously. And it's just that I don't have a good ear for harmony or singing, but I can write interesting stuff for voice. Keeping a beat or conducting, I found a very hard thing to do. Tapping back rhythms and all that stuff we had to do as undergraduates, I found hard. So it's that intellectualizing or physicalizing of rhythm I found hard. But boy, I can write rhythmic music because it's a visceral impulse, I think. And yes, I mean, I'm a closet rock drummer with the best of them. closet lots of things, but I think one's personality dictates quite a lot, and I rather regret, looking back, that I hadn't done more performing. I wrote a percussion piece for Gareth Farr that you may remember, Conundrums, and as we were rehearsing it, he said, "Come on, you should play it with me," and it's that kind of thing, and I've had a lot of little situations through my life, and this may be interesting to students, where I should have taken them up. If you're writing pieces, I remember John Rimmer said, write a part for yourself to play in the piece. In other words, if it's got a bass drum in it, you know, be able to play that. Because not every composer is a performer, and I'm not a composer-performer. A lot are, but a lot aren't.
You had a lot of influences in your life, visual arts, rock, and classical music. I was wondering, is it a conscious action implementing those inspirations in your music, or is it something that's more subconscious than that?
I think it's absolutely subconscious for all of us. I think what we do and how we think and how we write music is a sum total of everything we've ever heard, and it must be. It's very hard for us to filter out anything at all.
Consciously put, like you were talking about, you had that unclimbing out music in your music. Has there ever been an instance in which you've actually consciously implemented inspiration in your music?
Yes, a few times. Yeah, a few times, and I always feel a little bit guilty for doing it, because I've always, for some reason, been a purist about creating music that is only from me. And I remember having a conversation with Jack Boddy, and I said, "Oh, Jack, you're so clever, all these wonderful exotic pieces." "Oh, yes," he said, "but mine's all transcribed from other cultures. You think of it yourself." And it was just rather a funny exchange. So I've always felt I'm letting myself down by any sense of appropriation or borrowing. But then again, people say to me, "Oh, your music's so visual, and it reminds me of paintings." And really? I'm just creating sounds. Apart from specific times when I can't think of any. Well, the hymns that are going into the trumpet piece, for example.
I was going to say, you keep coming back to these hymns, and it's interesting how initially when Donald said, "Did you have any musical experiences in school?" and you sort of said, "No, it wasn't really musical at all." But then later on, you sort of went back and acknowledged that actually there was quite a lot of music. It was just that ritualistic aspect of
Yes.
how and when and where and for what.
Yes, and how one perceives it looking back. Because certainly music classes at school weren't a big thing, but I guess the school with the chapel, that was something else we did, so the singing there was something else. And I think music's something that I've done outside of school in particular. And even when I studied it at university, I realised that the teaching had less to do with it than what I was bringing to it myself, which is rather a strange realisation. And it's not to look askance at any of my wonderful teachers.
So I think we'll bring it to a close, but
Sure.
Could you just, in a minute or two, just tell us what's ahead for you?
Well, I've just announced early retirement from my job at Auckland University. I was going to say on a bit of an impulse, but that wouldn't be entirely correct. I've been teaching there for 25 years, and as a student there at least 10 years before that, because I did 3 degrees there in a row. And I just think I've done my time there, even though I love the job. And so I'm looking ahead to a freelance life, a get-poor-quick scheme, as somebody described it to me, but with lots of projects, and so I can branch out into collaborations with writers and visual artists and filmmakers, that kind of thing. Perhaps do some residencies. I don't quite know. I'd quite like to do a creative writing course. I quite like leaving it open-ended, and at this age you more or less have to. So I've got a trumpet chamber concerto performance in Scotland in February, and then I've got a solo portrait concert of my music in the Auckland Arts Festival in March, which is a nice thing to look ahead to. So there's always plenty going on.
Well, thanks so much for coming
Thank you,
today.
Donald.